They found him by the roadside, scarred and trembling, a chain still burned into his neck. At the shelter, Shadow destroyed every toy, rejected every hand, and carried the weight of a past no one could name. Until Sophie, a child with nothing but a drawing, showed him he wasn't alone. From then on, his life became a journey of broken trust, fierce protection, and a legacy that outlived him. Watch closely. This story is more than about a dog. Like and subscribe if you believe every soul deserves a second chance. The rain fell steady over the small town, washing the streets in silver and making the old street lamps glow like tired eyes. Haven Ridge Animal Shelter sat at the edge of town, a squat building of cinder blocks and chain-link runs. Inside, the smell of wet concrete and bleach mixed with the restless sounds of animals settling in for the night. Grace Parker parked her sedan and sat for a moment with her hands on the wheel. She was still new here, still finding her place. 2 weeks of orientation hadn't made her nerves any calmer, but she had promised herself she would give this work everything she had. She grabbed her tote bag from the passenger seat and stepped into the rain. When she walked in, Mark, the shelter manager, was waiting with his usual serious look. Beside him, Janet, the vet tech, clutched a clipboard. "You came on a night," Mark said. "Troopers are bringing something in. Found him out by the quarry. Doesn't sound good." The loading door rattled open and 2 troopers stepped inside, carrying a heavy metal crate between them. Inside the crate, a German shepherd crouched low, his coat wet and streaked with mud. One ear torn, his ribs sharp against the skin. His eyes caught the light in a way that made Grace's stomach twist. They didn't look wild. They looked tired, like he had been carrying fear too long. The trooper spoke quietly. "Wouldn't let us near him. He didn't attack, though. Just kept backing away until we boxed him in. He smells of burned rubber, maybe fire." They slid the crate into a corner run. Mark pulled the door open carefully, ready with a catch pole. But the dog didn't charge. He slid out slowly, pressed his body against the wall, and stayed there as if he wanted to disappear into the concrete. His nails scraped the floor. His chest rose and fell too fast. Shadow Mark muttered, "We'll call him that for now." Grace crouched a little to watch. His eyes flicked toward her shoes, then away. Not a challenge, not even suspicion, just the look of something that didn't know if safety was possible anymore. "He's not going to be easy," Mark said under his breath. A truck groaned down the hill outside, its brakes echoing through the walls. Shadow flinched so hard the cot in the run rattled. Janet shifted uneasy. Mark sighed. "We'll keep the aisle clear tonight. No one gets too close. He needs quiet." The first sign came then, not with a growl, not with violence, but with what he didn't do. When Mark shut the gate, his boot splashed a bit of water toward the dog. Shadow's lips pulled back for just a second, then he stopped. No lunge, no bite. He shrank into the wall instead, his whole body saying, "I'm not looking for a fight." Grace felt that deep in her chest. The shelter moved back into its rhythm. Doors closed, bowls clinked, heaters clicked on. Grace made her rounds, talking softly to each run, Moose, Jasper, Tilly names written in marker on whiteboards. When she returned to Shadow's corner, a towel hung over part of his gate to give him cover. She lowered herself to the floor nearby, not staring at him, not speaking, just breathing. The rain tapped on the roof. A baseball game murmured faintly from a radio in the office. She stayed still, letting silence work. Mark brought a bowl of food and slid it carefully inside. "An offering," he muttered. Shadow didn't move until Mark backed away. Then he crept forward on cautious paws, ate quickly, and retreated as if ashamed of his own hunger. That should have been the end of the night, but trouble has a way of testing the fragile. Erica, a brand new volunteer, came down the aisle carrying a hamper of fresh towels. She stumbled. A bundle fell and landed against Shadow's gate. One towel slipped through and brushed his paw. Erica gasped her fear loud in the quiet shelter. Everyone froze. Shadow jerked back, pressing himself against the wall so hard his nails scraped. His eyes shut halfway like he was bracing for pain. He didn't snap. He didn't strike. Grace moved slowly, crouched low, and pulled the towel back through. "It's all right, boy," she whispered. "No one's coming closer." Erica's face was pale, her hands trembling, but she nodded when Mark told her she'd done fine. Grace glanced at her notebook and wrote one line beside the dog's name. Backed away. Fear first. By closing time, the rain had softened to a mist. Mark checked the locks. Janet filed away the charts. Grace turned once more toward the row of runs. From Shadow's corner came the steady sound of breathing, calmer now, almost like sleep. Outside, the air smelled of wet asphalt. A freight train moaned beyond the river, that long, lonely American sound. Grace gripped her bag and whispered to herself, tomorrow, and the next day. She knew she would be back. Patience would be her only tool. Somewhere in the shadows of that run, a broken dog had chosen not to bite when fear gave him the chance. That wasn't a miracle, but it was a beginning. The next morning broke clear, the storm passed. The town carrying the washed scent of wet earth and leaves drying in the sun. Grace arrived early, her tote bumping against her hip, coffee warm in her hand, heart steadying itself for another day inside Haven Ridge. The shelter felt different in daylight. The hum of heaters gave way to the clatter of mop buckets and the voices of volunteers checking clipboards. Mark stood at the end of the hall, his shoulders tight as always, speaking to a man in a dark training vest. The man was called Carl, a contracted trainer who had worked with the shelter before. He carried confidence in his stance, the kind of ease that came with years of handling tough dogs. His voice was calm, but sure promising results. Grace listened as Carl explained his plan, direct eye contact. Firm commands, food as a reward, corrections when needed. Mark nodded. Janet hovered nearby, her concern written in the way she pressed the pen too hard against her notes. They led Carl toward Shadow's run. Grace stayed a step behind, not out of duty, but out of something like protection, though she knew she had no authority. Shadow was awake, pressed in his corner ears, flat, but eyes sharp. The towel still covered half the gate, and when it shifted slightly in the draft, Shadow's gaze darted like a bird's. Carl knelt in front of the gate, steadying his body, and called out firmly, "Sit!" His tone echoed in the aisle. Shadow's body stiffened, but he did not move. Carl tried again, louder. "Sit!" He slid a treat through the bars, waiting for compliance. Shadow inched forward, not for command, but for hunger, and as Carl reached to adjust the treat placement, Shadow's head shot forward. Teeth flashed. His jaws snapped against the metal bars with such force the sound cracked down the hall. Carl yanked his hand back in time, but not without a scrape. Blood welled across his knuckle, a sharp red line that made Janet gasp and Mark mutter that they needed to be careful. Shadow retreated again to his corner, not triumphant, not victorious, but coiled like a spring wound too tight. His sides heaved, his eyes darting from one human face to another. Carl wrapped a bandage around his hand and stood jaw tight, but words measured. "He's dangerous," he said simply, his voice low but carrying weight. Mark nodded heavily. "We'll keep him sedated if we have to. We can't risk more injuries." Janet bit her lip, her pen frozen against the clipboard. Grace said nothing, but she felt the words pressing inside her chest, too fragile to voice yet. When Carl left, Mark pulled Grace aside. "Don't get near him," he warned. "You saw it yourself. He's unpredictable. Some dogs don't come back from whatever they've been through." Grace nodded outwardly, but inside she carried a stubborn ember, the kind that refuses to be put out just because someone says it should. She returned to the aisle after the others had gone. The hall was quieter now, only the shuffle of paws and the soft whine of a hound 2 runs down. She sat near Shadow's gate again, lowering herself until she was level with the bottom bar. She didn't speak at first. She didn't reach for him. She let the silence breathe. Shadow's eyes caught her again, two wary lights in the dim. His body was still coiled, but his lips did not curl back. His throat did not rumble. Grace reached slowly into her tote and pulled out a paperback novel, one she had kept in her bag out of habit. She opened it and began to read, her voice low, not for performance, not even for him, but because words filled silence with something softer than fear. She read about a small town, about ordinary people, about choices that mattered in quiet ways. Her voice rose and fell gently. Shadow did not approach, but his ears twitched once, then again, a small sign that sound was reaching him differently than before. Minutes stretched. Grace shifted her legs, careful not to startle him, and continued. After a while, she closed the book and simply hummed a tune, something her grandmother had sung long ago. The melody was thin but steady. Shadow lowered his head to his paws. Not sleep, not trust, but not defiance either. For the first time since he had come through the trooper's hands, he was still without bracing himself for impact. Grace breathed slowly, memorizing the shape of this moment. Mark returned later and saw her sitting there, book in hand, Shadow watching without a growl. He frowned, but said nothing. Instead, he looked at the notes Carl had left on the counter, aggressive, unsafe, not trainable. He closed the folder quietly, not yet ready to argue, but not blind to what he had just seen. Grace rose when the day ended, her knees stiff, her tote heavy. She walked past Shadow's gate one last time, and for a second, his eyes met hers without flinching. She gave the smallest nod, the kind that meant, "I see you, even if no one else does." Then she left into the bright afternoon, the air holding the scent of damp grass and new beginnings. The following week settled into a rhythm, though no one would have called it easy. Grace came each morning, her notebook tucked under her arm, her face calm, though her stomach often knotted with nerves. Shadow remained in his corner eyes, sharp body taut, every muscle coiled as if expecting the world to betray him again. When Mark or Janet approached with bowls, Shadow's lips pulled back. His throat carried a low sound that made both of them step carefully. Yet when Grace came with food, his reaction was different. He did not greet her with warmth, not yet, but he allowed her to place the bowl inside without a growl. He waited until she stepped back, then moved forward and ate his ears, still tilted for danger. Mark noticed the difference and shook his head. "He's chosen you, Grace," he said one morning, "but don't think that makes him safe." Grace wrote in her notebook later that day, "Trust is a narrow bridge. One step too quick and it breaks." Shadow refused toys when others offered them. Janet tried a rope tug. He ignored it. Mark dropped a rubber ball. Shadow shoved it aside. But when Grace placed a small biscuit on top of a folded blanket and slid it into the run, he sniffed, hesitated, then took the treat. For a breath, hope stirred. He circled the blanket, nose twitching, body easing just slightly. Grace held still, her hands clasped in her lap. It looked like a moment that could become the beginning of comfort. Yet within seconds, Shadow seized the blanket in his teeth and shook it violently. The fabric tore, threads scattered across the floor like pale confetti. He shredded it until it was nothing but rags, then dropped the pieces in a heap and retreated to his corner once more. Janet had watched from down the hall and sighed. "See, he doesn't want kindness. He destroys it." Grace felt the sting of disappointment, not just for herself, but for what it meant. She studied the torn fabric and thought of how some wounds resist soft touches because softness reminds them of what they lost. Shadow's eyes met hers briefly, not triumphant, but wary, as if to say, "Don't expect too much from me." Days passed, each one offering small lessons. Grace noticed he waited for her footsteps before moving from his corner. He would not eat until she slid the bowl and sat at a distance. If another volunteer tried, the food remained untouched until it soured. Grace's patience became a quiet tether between them, fragile but undeniable. Still, the tension in the shelter deepened. Mark warned her again and again. One slip, Grace. One slip and someone gets hurt. He was not cruel. He was cautious, a man who had seen too many endings come too fast. One afternoon, Grace brought a second blanket, this one sturdier, and a soft chew toy shaped like a bone. She waited until the shelter was quiet, then placed them just inside. Shadow approached, slowly, sniffed the toy, and for a moment seemed curious. Grace held her breath. He lowered his head, took it gently between his teeth, and carried it to the corner. Hope lit across her chest like a spark catching kindling. But almost at once he began to rip at it, tearing seams, scattering stuffing across the concrete. Grace pressed her lips together, not angry, not defeated, but reminded again that healing does not follow straight lines. She wrote in her notebook, "He takes what I offer, but he doesn't know how to keep it whole." That night, as she prepared to leave, she found herself pausing by the shredded pieces. She realized Shadow was not trying to reject her gift. He was testing it, breaking it apart before it could break him. She whispered, "I'll try again tomorrow," though the dog was already curled tight in his corner, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. The staff continued their routines, voices carrying doubt. "Some animals can't be saved," one volunteer muttered. Grace heard, but she let the words pass like wind. Each morning she returned, each evening she left notes in her book. Shadow remained unchanged in many ways, still sharp, still defensive, but beneath the surface a pattern was forming. He did not lash out at her. He did not reject her presence. He tolerated her voice, her footsteps, her offerings. In a place where every kindness had once been torn away, even tolerance was a seed worth guarding. As another week ended, Grace left the shelter under a sunset that painted the town in long strokes of gold and red. Her notebook felt heavier with each entry her hope measured, but not gone. Behind her in the quiet hall of Haven Ridge, Shadow lay among the shreds of what had been gifts. He closed his eyes, not at peace, not yet safe, but breathing softer than before. It was not progress anyone else would measure, but for Grace it was enough to return again tomorrow. Saturday mornings at Haven Ridge were always noisier than weekdays. Volunteers arrived in clusters carrying bags of donated food leashes and second-hand toys. Grace was there early as usual, kneeling by Shadow's run with her notebook open on her lap, jotting down another short line about his reluctance to eat until the hallway cleared. She had learned to give him space, and she had accepted that trust would come in fragments. That morning, her daughter Sophie came with her for the first time. Sophie was 7, small and careful, with a way of holding herself that made her seem older than her years. Grace had hesitated to bring her, but the sitter canceled and she couldn't skip her shift. Sophie promised she would stay close, promised she would only watch. Grace had agreed, though her heart weighed heavier than usual. Mark raised an eyebrow when he saw the child, but he didn't object outright. "Keep her clear of Shadow," he said firmly. "That one doesn't bend." Grace nodded. Sophie stayed by her mother's side as they moved through the rows of runs. She peeked into cages, waved to dogs that barked or wagged, and whispered questions in Grace's ear. When they reached Shadow's run, Sophie stopped. The shepherd was pressed into his corner as always, eyes following every movement. Sophie crouched low, lowering herself to his level, and whispered softly, "Hi." Grace stiffened, ready to intervene, but something held her in place. Sophie reached into her pocket and pulled out a crumpled drawing she had made on the ride over a dog with a heart floating above its head. She slid it under the gate and said, "This is for you." The hallway fell into an odd silence. Mark froze halfway through filling a water dish. Janet looked up from her clipboard. Everyone watched for the inevitable snap, the low growl, the rush forward, but none of it came. Shadow lifted his head, ears twitching, and padded forward slowly. His paws clicked lightly against the concrete. He stopped just at the gate nose close to the paper and lowered himself to the floor. His eyes rested on the child, and for the first time since his arrival he was still without tension in his frame. Grace's breath caught. She wanted to pull Sophie back to shield her, but the sight rooted her in place. Sophie smiled small and steady, her knees drawn up to her chest as she whispered again, "It's okay." Shadow didn't answer, but his silence carried something different, something fragile and alive. The moment lasted no longer than a few breaths, but to Grace it felt like an hour. Then, almost as quickly as it came, it broke. Shadow backed away, returning to his corner with sudden haste. He curled into himself, nose pressed to the wall as though ashamed of what he had just done. Sophie tilted her head and whispered, "Did I scare him?" Grace touched her shoulder gently and shook her head. "No, honey. He just doesn't know what to do yet." Mark finally exhaled and muttered, "I'll be damned, though not unkindly." Janet scribbled a note, her eyes wide with disbelief. The volunteers exchanged glances, whispers spreading. Grace pulled Sophie back slowly, thanking her quietly, and folded the drawing in her own notebook to keep safe. Shadow stayed in his corner unmoving, but his body shook faintly with something that looked less like fear and more like confusion. The rest of the morning passed in routine, but the air around the shelter felt different. Word of what Sophie had done rippled outward. By noon, every volunteer had peeked down the aisle, curious to see if Shadow had truly softened. They saw only a dog pressed against the wall, refusing to come near again. To most, it seemed like a false start, another dead end. To Grace, it was proof that the wall around him had cracks, no matter how quickly he tried to patch them. Later, when the hall was quiet again, Grace knelt by the run with Sophie beside her. The drawing still lay inside untouched, but not trampled, a fragile gift allowed to remain. Shadow's eyes opened briefly, met Sophie's, then turned away. He would not come forward again, not that day. Grace stroked Sophie's hair and whispered, "Sometimes the first step scares them more than the silence before it." Sophie leaned against her mother's arm, thoughtful as if she understood. By evening, when the last volunteers had gone home and the shelter lights dimmed, Grace walked the aisles once more. She passed Moose Jasper Tilly, each barking or wagging, each clamoring for attention. When she reached Shadow, he was lying with his nose an inch from the drawing. His eyes closed slowly, his breathing, even his body curled, not in defense, but in weary surrender. Grace whispered, "Tomorrow," the same promise she made each night, and left with Sophie's small hand clasped in hers. Outside, the air was cool, carrying the faint scent of cut grass and summer settling in. Grace knew the road ahead was longer than most would be willing to walk, but she also knew something had shifted. Shadow had chosen not to growl. He had chosen to come forward. And though he had retreated again, the memory of that choice would stay alive until the next chance arrived. The following week brought a sharp change in the shelter's routine. A veterinary technician from the county arrived to scan the new arrivals, carrying a small handheld microchip reader. Grace watched from the hallway as the technician moved from kennel to kennel, pausing briefly at each door, jotting down notes. When she reached Shadow's run, Mark stepped forward to help catch pole in hand, his jaw set tight. Grace tensed but stayed back, aware that Shadow still barely tolerated her presence and no one else's. The gate opened just enough for the wand to slip through, and the device beeped with a sudden electronic chirp. Janet looked down at the reader, her eyes widening. "He's chipped," she said quietly. "We've got an ID." The hallway went still. Mark took the reader, read the numbers aloud, and handed them to Janet to cross-check. Minutes later, she returned with a printed sheet in her hand. Owners listed. Name Robert Whitman, address 3 towns over. Grace's stomach tightened. Shadow had a name before this place. He had a life. The discovery rippled through the staff, each of them reacting in their own way. Janet seemed relieved, murmuring, "At least he wasn't always alone." Mark rubbed his forehead and muttered about the possibility of returning him. Grace's mind raced torn between the hope of reunion and the fear of what that reunion might drag into the present. The next day, while cleaning Shadow's run, Grace noticed something she had not seen before. When she slid the cot aside to scrub the corner, she saw the raw line of an old scar beneath his fur running from shoulder to rib. It was not fresh, but it carried a story written in tissue and time. She reached no closer, but her eyes lingered. Shadow shifted uneasily, pressing himself tighter to the wall, as if he remembered every second of how that scar had been carved. Grace whispered gently, "It's all right, boy," though she knew words could not erase whatever his body held. That afternoon, Janet returned with a file folder and a faded photograph sent by the county office. It showed a younger version of Shadow sitting on a porch beside a man in a plaid shirt. The man had a hand on the dog's neck, smiling as if the world were simple. Grace stared at the photo. The resemblance was undeniable, yet the shadow in that picture looked whole, not the fractured creature pressed against the concrete now. Mark nodded toward the file. "We'll contact him, see if he still wants the dog back." Grace's chest grew heavy. She had watched Shadow retreat from every hand but hers and Sophie's. The thought of forcing him back into a past he might not want made her restless. Still, protocol carried weight, and the call was made. Mr. Whitman answered, his voice worn with age, astonishment, and something that sounded like hope. He confirmed Shadow had been stolen nearly a year ago. He had searched filed reports, even posted flyers, until silence convinced him the dog was gone forever. He agreed to come to the shelter in a few days. That evening, Grace carried the photo down the hall, unable to leave it on the desk. She crouched by Shadow's gate and slid the image just inside, laying it flat on the concrete. For a long moment, Shadow did not move. Then he approached Nostril's flaring eyes, locking onto the younger version of himself. His body stiffened, his ears pinned back. He let out a sharp, broken sound, not a bark, not a growl, but a strangled whine. Suddenly he lunged, paws crashing down on the paper teeth, snapping, shredding the photo into strips. His body thrashed with panic tail, rigid eyes wide with terror. He bolted back into the corner, pressing against the wall as if trying to dig his way through it. His chest heaved, his breath ragged saliva flecking the floor. Grace jerked the remaining scraps back through the bars, her hands trembling, heart pounding. She whispered softly, "It's gone. It's gone," though. Her words barely reached him. Mark rushed down the hall at the noise, his eyes narrowing. "What happened?" Grace lifted the torn paper, her voice low. He didn't want to remember. Mark frowned, frustration and pity crossing his features. He has to face it. His owner's coming. That night, Grace lay awake, the memory of Shadow's panic looping through her mind. She replayed the moment his paws hit the photograph. The fear in his eyes, the violence born not of hatred, but of memory. Sophie's drawing still rested safe in Grace's notebook, untouched, accepted. The contrast burned deep. One piece of paper he guarded, another he destroyed. She realized the past was not just heavy, it was unbearable for him. At the shelter the next morning, Shadow refused food until the aisle was empty. When Grace finally set down his bowl, he ate quickly, but kept glancing at the gate, restless as though expecting the past to burst through the door. Grace sat nearby, quiet, steady, her voice a low hum. "You don't have to go back there," she whispered, though she knew the decision was no longer in her hands. By midweek, preparations were made for Mr. Whitman's visit. The staff spoke of reunion, as if it were certain, as if one man's memory could erase another creature's scars. Grace felt torn between procedure and instinct, between the rules of the shelter and the silent plea in Shadow's eyes. She knew the meeting would change everything, though she did not know which way the scales would tip. The day of the reunion arrived with skies heavy and gray, the kind that pressed low over the town as if the air itself were holding its breath. Grace drove to the shelter with Sophie in the back seat, her daughter coloring quietly in a notebook, humming a tune to herself. Grace gripped the wheel, her chest tight with unease. She had not told Sophie exactly what was going to happen, only that someone important to Shadow's past was coming. When they pulled into the gravel lot, Mark's truck was already there, parked close to the entrance. The sight made Grace's pulse quicken. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Janet arranged papers on the counter, her hands neat but restless. Mark stood by the main door, speaking in a low tone to a man leaning heavily on a cane. The man's face was lined with age, his shoulders stooped, his eyes carrying a mixture of weariness and longing. In his other hand he held a worn leather collar, its brass nameplate polished by years of touch. Grace recognized him immediately as Robert Whitman. He clutched the collar the way someone clutches proof that a story they once told themselves was not a dream. When Whitman's eyes fell on Grace, he nodded politely, but with a kind of searching in his gaze. "I've come for my boy," he said softly. His voice trembled with both hope and dread. Grace wanted to answer, but found her throat tight. Instead, she stepped aside as Mark gestured toward the hallway. "We'll take you to him," Mark said. The group moved slowly down the aisle of kennels. Dogs barked and whined, their voices echoing, but Shadow's run remained strangely quiet. He was lying on his cot, head on his paws, body tense, but still. When Whitman approached, Shadow lifted his head, ears pricking slightly. The old man crouched with difficulty, knees stiff, and slid the collar gently against the bars. "Rex," he whispered, calling the name from the old file, the name etched into the brass. "It's me, remember?" His hand trembled as he held out the faded photograph of the porch, the one Grace had seen torn apart. Shadow's eyes locked on the object, his body stiffening. For a moment, the hallway seemed to wait for recognition, for a joyful surge forward for the miracle everyone wanted to believe in. But the dog stayed still. His gaze darted from the collar to the old man's face, then back to the floor. He shifted uneasily, his paws tapping against the concrete. A whine caught in his throat. Then he stepped back toward the corner, pressing against the wall, tail low. Whitman's face crumpled. His voice cracked. "You don't remember me." His cane slipped slightly on the floor as he steadied himself, his knuckles white around the handle. Mark cleared his throat, uncertain, glancing toward Grace. Janet scribbled notes nervously as if trying to capture order from chaos. Grace's heart ached at the sight. At that moment, Sophie, who had been standing quietly behind her mother, took a hesitant step forward. She crouched low the same way she had weeks before and whispered, "It's okay, Shadow. You don't have to be scared." Her small voice carried down the aisle like a thread of light. Shadow's ears twitched. His head turned sharply toward Sophie. Slowly, almost painfully, he moved forward, not to the collar, not to the photograph, not to the hand of the man who had once called him Rex, but toward the little girl crouched on the floor. He pressed his body close to the gate where Sophie's fingers rested lightly against the bars. His nose touched her knuckles, a soft nudge, a choice made clear. The silence that followed was heavy. Whitman's eyes glistened and he gave a small nod, though his face carried the weight of a heart breaking. "I see," he said softly. "He's found someone else now." His words held no bitterness, only resignation, the acceptance of a truth he could not bend. He withdrew the collar, slowly folding it into his coat pocket, his shoulders sagging with the movement. Sophie looked up at her mother, uncertain. Grace placed a hand on her daughter's back and whispered, "He chose you." Mark rubbed the back of his neck, troubled, but he did not argue. Janet lowered her clipboard, her lips pressed tight. Whitman struggled to his feet, leaning heavily on his cane. He placed the photograph on the ground outside the run, not inside this time, and whispered, "Be happy, boy." Shadow watched him for a moment, then turned back to Sophie, settling once more by the gate. Grace felt a swell of emotion rise in her chest. sorrow for the old man and awe for the bond unfolding before her eyes. When Whitman finally left the shelter's door, closing softly behind him, the air in the hallway seemed to shift. Grace knelt beside Sophie, pulling her close. Shadow's eyes stayed fixed on the child, his breathing calmer, his body less tense. The choice had been made silent, but unmistakable. That evening, after the volunteers had gone and the aisles grew quiet, Grace returned to Shadow's run one last time. The torn blanket still lay in the corner, the remnants of trust still scattered, but beside it now was Sophie's drawing, kept safe. Shadow lay with his nose near it, eyes half closed, as though the decision had given him rest. Grace whispered, tomorrow her nightly promise, and knew tomorrow would bring new challenges, but also the first glimpse of a future not bound by the past. The days after Mr. Whitman's visit carried a strange weight at Haven Ridge. Grace could feel it in the way Mark's voice grew shorter during morning check-ins, in the way Janet avoided talking about Shadow, and in the way Sophie clutched her drawing book tighter each time they visited. The dog had made his choice, but instead of calming the shelter, the decision seemed to unsettle everyone more. Some whispered about liability, others about danger, and Mark repeated often that one calm moment did not erase weeks of volatility. Grace tried to focus on what she saw with her own eyes, the way Shadow's body eased whenever Sophie was near. The way his growl never rose when she crouched by his run, the way he leaned closer each day. It was late one afternoon when the turning point arrived. Volunteers were tidying the front lobby, stacking boxes of donated food and folding towels. Grace was finishing her notes near Shadow's run, Sophie at her side with crayons scattered across her lap. The shelter was quiet except for the occasional bark. Then Shadow's head lifted sharply, ears pricked, eyes fixed toward the far end of the hallway. His body stiffened, his nose working the air, a low rumble building in his chest. Grace followed his gaze, but saw nothing unusual. "What is it, boy?" she whispered. His body leaned forward, muscles taut, his attention unwavering. A moment later, the front door creaked, followed by hurried voices. Rachel, another volunteer, rushed in, her face pale. "Sophie's friend Clara is missing," she said breathlessly. "Her mom called. She was supposed to walk straight home from school, but she never arrived." Grace froze her arm instinctively, pulling Sophie closer. The room filled with alarmed voices, phones pulled from pockets, questions overlapping. Amid the noise, Shadow let out a sudden bark, sharp and insistent, then pawed at his gate. His nose pressed low, sniffing the air, pulling back, then pressing again. His tail was rigid, his eyes locked toward the exit. Grace's heart hammered. "He knows," she whispered, the certainty rising inside her. Mark barked back an order to stay clear, but Grace was already unclipping the gate's latch. "Don't," he snapped, stepping forward, but Grace clipped a leash onto Shadow's collar before anyone could stop her. The shepherd surged forward, pulling her down the hall with urgent force. Sophie clung to Janet, eyes wide with fear and hope all at once. Outside, the evening air carried the damp chill of oncoming rain. Shadow sniffed hard, swung his head, then charged toward the edge of the lot. Grace stumbled, gripping the leash, but she let him lead. Mark shouted behind her, but his voice was drowned by the pounding of her own pulse. They crossed the street, Shadow's nose to the ground, weaving sharply, following a scent Grace could not see. The dog pulled with relentless focus, turning corners, cutting down an alley leading her past the old bookstore that had long since closed. At the back gate of the building, Shadow stopped, barked twice, and clawed at the wood. Grace yanked it open and gasped. There, huddled under a broken overhang, was Clara. Her cheeks streaked with tears, her knees scraped her backpack tossed aside. She looked up, trembling, and whispered, "I got scared. A man followed me, so I hid." Before Grace could respond, Shadow moved forward, lowering himself beside the girl, his body pressed close, his head resting gently against her shoulder. Clara clutched at his fur, sobbing into it, the sound raw and real. Grace dropped to her knees, wrapping her arms around them both. relief flooding through her. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance, neighbors already calling police. When the officers arrived, Clara was carried back to her mother's arms. Shadow stood guard, his chest rising and falling steadily, eyes watchful. He had not growled, not snapped, only protected. Grace's heart swelled as she watched, knowing what this meant, knowing he had revealed who he truly was. But back at the shelter, the debate began before the relief had even faded. Mark paced the office, his voice firm. Yes, he found her. Yes, it was remarkable. But one act does not erase the risk. He could have turned on Clara just as easily. Janet shook her head. You didn't see him. He was calm. He protected her. Mark countered. He's unpredictable. Today it worked. Tomorrow we could be writing an incident report. Grace stood silent. Sophie leaning against her side, listening as the argument swirled. She wanted to shout that Shadow had proven himself, but she knew words would not change Mark's fear. By nightfall, the shelter was divided. Some believed Shadow had shown his true nature at last, a guardian who needed only patience to reveal himself. Others believed he was still too broken, too dangerous to trust. Grace knelt by his run, watching him settle onto his cot. Eyes closing slowly, body resting easier than she had ever seen. She whispered, "They don't see it yet, but I do. You saved her. You saved us." Outside the window, rain began to fall, tapping against the glass. Grace knew the coming days would bring harder questions, choices that might cut deeper than any they had faced so far. The debate was not finished. It was only beginning. The shelter carried the weight of divided opinion in the days after Clara was found. Some volunteers whispered that Shadow had proven himself once and for all, but others muttered about risk liability and what might happen next time. Grace stayed quiet during the arguments, yet she could not shake the image of Shadow pressed against Clara, steady as a wall, gentle as a shadow of comfort. Sophie drew pictures of him daily, slipping them under the bars when Grace allowed. Shadow kept each one near his cot, never tearing them, never discarding them. Still, Mark's warnings hung heavy over every visit. "He's unpredictable," he reminded her. "Don't forget what he's done." Grace knew the truth lived in both halves of that sentence. Shadow had a past marked by violence, but he also had a present where loyalty burned bright. The test came on a windy afternoon when the power lines over town snapped in a sudden storm. The shelter went dark except for the faint glow of emergency lights. Dogs barked frantically, their voices overlapping, bouncing against the concrete walls. Volunteers rushed with flashlights trying to calm the chaos. Outside, sirens wailed in the distance, the storm having triggered accidents across the county. The air was tense, heavy with static and fear. In the middle of that confusion, Janet rushed down the hallway, her face pale. "Gas leak," she shouted. The utility crew called in a warning. "They think a line's been ruptured near the shelter. We may have to evacuate." Panic rippled instantly. Volunteers scrambled, unsure how to move so many animals quickly. Grace felt Sophie's hand clutch hers, trembling. Mark barked orders to secure doors and prepare transport cages. Yet amid the confusion, Shadow's body was alert, his nose lifted, sniffing the air with intensity. He barked once, sharp and commanding, then pressed against the gate, pulling with all his weight. Grace knew in her gut what he was sensing. Without thinking, she grabbed the leash clipped to the gate and fastened it to Shadow's collar. Grace No Mark shouted, rushing forward, but she had already swung the gate open. Shadow surged out, not wildly, but with controlled urgency. He pulled her down the hall, weaving between barking kennels, ignoring the frantic noise, moving with purpose. His nose traced the air, his head turning until he locked on a direction. He tugged hard toward the back exit. Grace stumbled but held tight, her trust overriding her fear. Shadow led them out into the whipping wind, his body low, his movements precise. Behind them, Janet and Mark scrambled, Sophie clutched in Janet's arms. The smell hit Grace, then faint but real, the acrid bite of gas carried on the breeze. Shadow pulled harder, leading them away from the main lot past the old chain-link fence toward the far field. They reached a spot where the ground was uneven, and there, half hidden by fallen branches, a broken pipe hissed quietly, leaking fumes into the storm. Shadow barked once, then stopped standing guard between the pipe and the humans. He did not lunge, did not panic. He planted his body firmly, ears alert, gaze fixed as if daring anyone to step closer. Grace realized he had not only found the danger, but chosen to place himself between it and the people he trusted. The utility crew arrived minutes later, their trucks grinding into the lot, men in heavy gear, moving quickly to shut off the flow. They praised Grace for leading them to the exact spot, but she knew in her heart she had not led anything. It was Shadow. He had read the wind, followed the trace, and guided them with precision. Back at the shelter, after the danger passed, the dogs calmed and the lights flickered back on. The debate resumed almost immediately. Mark's voice was sharp. She could have been dragged into danger. That dog doesn't know restraint. What if he had bolted? What if he had turned? Janet shook her head, her voice firm. You didn't see him. He knew exactly what he was doing. He saved us. Sophie tugged at her mother's sleeve and whispered, He was brave. Grace knelt by Shadow's side, brushing a hand carefully along his neck. His chest rose and fell calmly, his eyes steady, his body relaxed as if the storm inside him had eased. Mark turned away with frustration, muttering about protocol and rules, but Grace saw something more important, a dog who had not only proven loyalty, but also judgment, who had guided rather than lashed out. Shadow had chosen not to be ruled by fear. He had chosen to protect. That night, when the shelter finally quieted, Grace sat by his run once more. Sophie slipped another drawing through the bars, this one of Shadow standing tall with people behind him, a line of safety drawn in crayon. The dog placed his paw gently on the paper, not tearing it, simply holding it there as though to claim it. Grace whispered, They'll see it one day. They'll understand. The storm had passed, but the battle was far from over. Shadow had shown loyalty and restraint, yet the fight for his place in the world had only grown sharper. The week after the gas leak incident brought unexpected attention to Haven Ridge. News of Shadow's actions spread quickly, carried first by local radio, then by a short piece in the county newspaper. Shelter dog alerts. Staff to gas leak. The headline read, and soon the phones began ringing. Families called with adoption offers, some curious, some eager to own a dog branded both dangerous and heroic. Letters arrived with photos of yards, stories of other pets, promises of training. For a shelter used to begging for homes, it felt almost overwhelming. Mark stacked the forms in neat piles on his desk, shaking his head at the irony. When we needed homes, no one showed up. Now they come running for the one dog we can't place. Grace watched from the background, her heart uneasy. She had seen Shadow with Sophie, seen the gentleness he reserved for her alone. She doubted any stranger could step into that fragile bond. Still, the shelter had to try. On Saturday, the first family arrived, a tall man, his wife, and 2 teenage sons. They carried treats and spoke in cheerful voices as they approached Shadow's run. He did not come forward. Instead, he pressed into the corner, his body rigid, his eyes locked on the floor. The boys whistled, the father crouched, the mother called softly. Shadow did not move. When the man extended a hand too close to the bars, Shadow bared his teeth and let out a guttural sound that sent the family stepping back quickly. They left minutes later, their voices polite but disappointed. Another family came the following day, this time with a younger child carrying a plush toy. For a moment, Grace wondered if Shadow might soften, but he only glanced once, then turned away, curling tightly on his cot. The child dropped the toy by the bars, but Shadow ignored it completely. Mark retrieved the toy, later frowning. "He's not giving anyone a chance," he muttered. Janet argued, "Maybe we're offering the wrong chance." By the end of the week, 6 different families had visited, and every attempt ended the same. Shadow retreating, growling, or turning his face away. The volunteers grew restless, whispers rising again about wasted effort. Mark considered sending him to a specialized facility, muttering about space and resources. Grace bit her tongue but wrote furiously in her notebook, "He is chosen already. Why can't they see it?" One quiet afternoon. Sophie came to the shelter after school, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders. Grace watched as she skipped down the hall, her voice carrying a soft, "Shadow, I'm here." The shepherd's head lifted instantly. He rose from his corner, walked to the bars, and pressed his nose against them with a low whine. Sophie crouched and slid a new drawing through this time of a house with a yard herself and Shadow standing side by side beneath a blue sky. Shadow placed his paw gently on the paper and lay down his body calm, his eyes resting peacefully on her face. Volunteers watching from the doorway stood in stunned silence. Mark rubbed his temples. He doesn't want anyone else. Just her. His voice was tired, not angry, more like a man cornered by truth. Janet nodded slowly. Then maybe that's the answer. Maybe he goes where he already belongs. Mark hesitated. We can't just hand him over. Liability paperwork rules. Grace spoke quietly. Then call it a foster placement. Call it temporary if you have to. But you know as well as I do he won't take to anyone else. After a long pause, Mark agreed. The paperwork was drawn up with words like trial basis and temporary foster arrangement, but the truth was clear. Shadow would be leaving the shelter not with a stranger, but with Sophie and her family. Grace signed the forms with hands that trembled slightly, her heart heavy with the weight of responsibility, yet lighter than it had felt in months. That evening, as the sun dipped low, Grace opened Shadow's run for the first time without hesitation. Sophie stood beside her, her face glowing with excitement. Shadow stepped out, not rushing, not tense, but steady. He walked straight to Sophie, his body leaning gently against her legs. She giggled softly, wrapping her arms around his neck. For the first time, Grace saw him not as the broken, dangerous creature they had feared, but as a dog choosing where he belonged. Mark stood by the door, arms folded, his expression a mix of worry and reluctant acceptance. "Take care of him," he said simply. Grace met his eyes and answered, "We will." Shadow glanced once around the shelter, then followed Sophie out into the fading light. The gravel crunched beneath their steps, the air cool with evening. Grace felt the chapter turning as clearly as the pages of her notebook. The car door closed with a soft thud, Sophie's hand never leaving Shadow's fur. For the first time, he was leaving Haven Ridge, not as a stray, not as a danger, but as part of something fragile and new. Grace whispered as she started the engine, "Let's go home." The years passed gently, carrying both change and constancy. Shadow no longer slept behind steel bars or on the hard cot of a shelter run. Instead, he claimed the rug by Sophie's bed, his body stretched long, his ears twitching each time she stirred in the night. Grace often paused at the doorway to watch them, her daughter growing taller while the dog slowly grayed around the muzzle, his movements slowing but his eyes never dimming. He was more than a pet. He was a guardian, a companion, a silent witness to the shaping of a young life. By the time Sophie reached high school, Shadow had grown stiff in the hips. His steps were slower, his naps longer, but his loyalty remained sharp. Each afternoon he rose to greet her, tail wagging with the same steady rhythm that had marked the first days of their bond. He followed her into the garden as she studied, lay beside her as she painted or wrote, and pressed his head into her hands whenever the world felt heavier than her shoulders could carry. Grace sometimes worried about the years catching up to him, but she also knew the quiet gift of a loyal companion who had found where he belonged. One autumn evening, the wind rattled the windows as Sophie prepared for a school presentation. She was nervous, pacing her room. her papers spread across the bed. Shadow lifted himself with effort, padded slowly across the floor, and pressed against her legs until she stopped moving. She sank to the rug, resting her forehead against his, her breath slowing as if his calm strength had poured into her. "You always know," she whispered. Shadow closed his eyes, a silent acknowledgement that needed no words. Time, however, does not pause. By the time Sophie wore her graduation gown, Shadow's coat had turned silver along his back. He could not climb the bleachers where families cheered, but he sat patiently in the front row beside Grace, his tail thumping slowly as Sophie crossed the stage. She searched the crowd, only once her eyes finding him, and smiled through tears as she accepted her diploma. He wagged, tired but proud, as if the moment was his achievement too. The years beyond brought more change. Sophie left for college but came home on weekends, her car pulling into the driveway with Shadow waiting by the window, ears lifting despite the strain of age. She studied veterinary science, inspired by the bond that had carried her through childhood. Each story she wrote for class circled back to him, the dog who had once been feared, who had once been broken, who had chosen her above all else. When Shadow reached his final winter, his steps faltered often. He moved like an old soldier carrying invisible weight, but still he followed Sophie whenever she was near. On one particularly cold night, when the wind rattled hard against the house, Sophie woke from a dream unsettled. She found him beside her bed, his body trembling slightly. She slid to the floor, wrapped a blanket around them both, and whispered, "I'm here." He leaned into her, his breathing uneven, but his gaze calm. For a long time they sat together in silence, her warmth against his fading strength, her tears hidden in the thick fur of his neck. That night, as if knowing the circle was nearly complete, Shadow lifted his head once more. A sound outside, the creak of a branch, the faint crunch of snow, caught his ears. He rose with unexpected steadiness, positioned himself between Sophie and the door, his frame still holding the instinct to protect. She watched in awe, realizing he would guard her until his last breath. When the sound faded, he eased back to her side, lowered himself carefully, and rested his head in her lap. His eyes closed slowly. His breathing grew shallow, and with her hand stroking his neck, he drifted peacefully into the final rest. Sophie did not cry out. She stayed with him until dawn, her tears falling quietly, her hand never leaving him. Grace entered softly in the morning and found her daughter sitting with the dog who had once been called dangerous, now gone in peace. They buried him beneath the oak tree in the yard, Sophie placing his collar and her oldest drawing inside the wooden box. The soil was heavy, but her heart carried something lighter, the knowledge that love like his did not end with silence. Years later, Sophie opened a small rescue clinic of her own. Dogs with scars, cats with broken tails, creatures the world had given up on, all found a place in her care. She moved with patience, spoke with calm, and believed in second chances. When volunteers asked her where she had learned that kind of faith, she smiled softly and pointed to the photograph framed on her desk. A young girl kneeling by a shepherd, whose eyes had once been filled with fear, but had later glowed with loyalty. On certain evenings when the wind swept through the trees and rattled the shelter windows, Sophie swore she could feel the brush of a tail against her leg or the weight of a head on her hand. She never chased the feeling away. She welcomed it, knowing that some companions never truly leave. They live on in the rhythm of footsteps, in the quiet strength given to those they once protected, in the choices that honor their memory. Shadow's story proves that even the most wounded hearts can find healing through loyalty and love. Which moment spoke to you most deeply? Share it in the comments and let me know where you're watching from. If you'd like more stories like this one, make sure to like the video and subscribe so you never miss the next chapter.